Welcome to Renovate. I'm Jenny, and I'll be your guide through this experience. To begin, let me ask you a question. Have you ever embarked on a home renovation project? You likely began with a search for a picture or image of the new room or the new addition that you long to see become a reality. If you're anything like me, you may spend way too much time watching HGTV or searching Pinterest for inspiration. It's easy to get stuck or paralyzed with all of the options. Or maybe you're the type who takes on a renovation project on your own and you spend hours watching YouTube to become an architect, electrician, plumber, and carpenter. But then once your renovation begins, well, it never seems to go exactly as you planned, right? You discover things along the way that you didn't want to see. You realize there is way more to the project. You find things behind the drywall that become a new problem, a leaking pipe, wiring that needs updating, or termites. Eek! It's easy to feel stuck because as much as we may like to stop the reno, can you really live with a half-completed project? Usually somewhere along the way with the home renovation, I wonder, now why did I want to do this in the first place? This is so hard. In a home renovation, it's easy to get stuck. The same is true for personal renovations. It can be hard to start a new exercise routine even though we know it's good for our physical health. It can also be tough to stick to a budget even though we know it's good for our financial health. And from time to time, we can all get stuck in ways of thinking or behaviors. We can tend to repeat the same behavior even though it hasn't worked any of the other times that we've tried it. Or we keep taking different routes to the same dead-end relationships, dead-end jobs. Or we try our best to control our anger, but it seems our anger frequently gets the best of us. Or we tell ourselves that we won't play the comparison game and obsess over things we don't have, but then your neighbor drives up in that car, or the picture of your friend's vacation appears on your social media feed, and the spiral begins. Often, what's behind patterns like that is a thought, or a way of thinking really, that's keeping us trapped. That's why we've created Renovate. Through these 4 sessions, we'll provide a picture of the new life that is possible for us. Through this personal renovation, you'll explore past beliefs and how they've impacted your life. We'll also look at the blueprint that God makes available to every one of us. Along the way, you'll complete a design plan that will help you craft your next steps going forward. Personal renovations take time and effort. There is no quick fix. But as the old adage says, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So if you're feeling stuck, you're in the right place. This journey of renovation will help you get unstuck one small change at a time. This is a process that not everyone undertakes, so give yourself a big pat on the back. I'm confident when you look back on this personal renovation process, you'll be amazed by the results. You will be so thankful you did it. I know I am. So are you ready to renovate? Let's get started. In this session, you'll hear from my friend Chris Kim. Chris will share about his own renovation journey, and he will share a principle that is so key for establishing a strong foundation for growth. Take a listen to Chris, and then I'll be back at the end to wrap up.
Growing up, I was a pretty quiet kid. At home, I was loud, talkative, obnoxious, energetic, as most children are. But when I got outside the home, when I stepped outside, I was a totally different person. I was quiet, I was reserved, I was pretty shy, keeping my ideas and thoughts to myself. Now, when I got to middle school and high school, this actually worked in my favor because most teachers actually preferred quieter students that didn't talk as much or didn't disrupt the class, and I was that kind of student. That was me. And so I did well. I got good grades and all of that. And then I went to college and started enrolling in smaller classes oriented around discussion, where you had to be vocal, where you had to contribute, where you had to talk. Essentially, I was graded on how much I could talk. And as you can imagine, my grades started to slip. I wasn't doing so well. I would go into every discussion group, every discussion class with thoughts about what I wanted to share, with things that I wanted to say. But after an hour, 60 minutes, when class was over, I left having not opened my mouth once. And I realized that this was a behavior that I would have to change. This was a behavior that I would have to change. All of us have behaviors. All of us have certain behaviors. A lot of them are good. Some of you exercise regularly, eat really well. We don't want you to change any of those behaviors. But some of you, maybe you don't exercise all that well. Maybe you have poor dietary habits. And I bet you at some point you've thought, hey, I'd really like to change that behavior. Bad behaviors, especially unhealthy behaviors, people want to change all the time because they're easy to recognize, but the reality is that they're actually very difficult to change. How many of you have struggled with worry? You end up worrying a lot. And as a result, you get a little bit more agitated, you get a little bit more panicky, your anxiety level raises up, and you want to change that. And people tell you to change. They might say something like, hey, calm down, or stop worrying, or hey, don't worry. That's like the worst thing to tell a worrier, calm down. That's the most uncalming thing to say to someone. It usually doesn't work. It's not very easy to change that behavior. For me, I tried to change my behavior in class of trying to speak up a little bit more. My friends and my professors, they would say, hey, Chris, just speak up. Just say whatever's on your mind. Just speak up. And I was so frozen by that. I had stuff I wanted to say. I would even tell myself, hey, remember to say this. But as soon as I was about to open my mouth to say it, there was something in my mind that said, that's not a very smart thing to say. That's not very insightful, Chris, so just keep your mouth shut. Or that's not very valuable. Someone else already said that. You don't have to say that. And I was constantly thinking about the perfect thing to say. And as a result, I ended up saying nothing at all. I was frozen like that. So as a result, I ended up actually talking to a counselor about how I could get myself to be a little bit more vocal in my discussion classes. And as I'm telling him my story, he says, Chris, hey, we can talk about some strategies to address your behavior. But then he said this, there's actually something deeper going on. Because behind every behavior is a belief. And behind every unhealthy behavior is a false belief. And Chris, if you want to change the unhealthy behavior, then first you got to change the false belief behind it. If you want to change the unhealthy behavior, then first you have to change the false belief behind it. We all subscribe to some false beliefs. And these beliefs were often influenced by our parents, by our peers, by our friends, and often at a very early age, maybe through an event. For example, many of you moved around during your childhood years for whatever reason. And as a result, you ended up having to say a lot of hellos and meeting a lot of new people, but then also having to say a lot of goodbyes and saying goodbye to a lot of people, a lot of relationships that you invested in. And it got to a point where you started feeling, if I get close to someone, I'm eventually going to get hurt. So you developed this false belief that I must not risk intimacy to be safe. And that false belief then led to an unhealthy behavior of I have to close off my feelings. So every time you moved, you closed off your feelings and you were never able to develop long-lasting, healthy relationships. Here's another example that I know most of us have probably experienced. The idea of receiving approval after performing well. How many of you received approval from your parents or a loved one after you performed well? Which also meant that if you didn't perform well, you were met with disappointment or ridicule. Well, if that's the case, then it's a no-brainer that you'd subscribe to the false belief that you had to perform to be loved. That's the false belief. I must perform to be loved. And as a result, you would develop a behavior of working to gain acceptance. And that behavior then takes fruit in your life and all the different relationships that you've had, with your significant other, with your family, with your spouse, maybe even with your kids. For me, my family comes from Korea, and we immigrated to the States when I was 2. So for our family, English was a second language, especially for my parents. At home we would speak Korean and English and all that, but when we went outside, they had a difficult time communicating. And now I realize that, there's tons of challenges around communication for them and all that kind of stuff. But I would remember when we would go to a restaurant, my parents would order something and the waiter would bring a different entree, something that we didn't order. And my parents would never send it back. They'd never call the waiter back over because they were always afraid of making a mistake in the conversation with the waiter. They weren't confident with their mastery of the English language. And so they would eat there, eating something that they did not want to eat, eating something that they never ordered, all because they didn't want to make a mistake, all because they were unwilling to contribute to a conversation that would have made things right, but they weren't sure about it. They didn't want to make that mistake. I remember my dad, he never had very long conversations with customer service representatives on the phone. He would always ask them to send him a letter to communicate whatever it is that they were communicating. Because with the letter, he could sit down for hours upon end with letter in hand and the Korean English dictionary in the other hand, and he could write his response perfectly without a mistake, looking up every word that he didn't know. That was him. So for me, as a kid, it got ingrained in me that I should only speak up, that I should only contribute, that I should only be vocal if I knew I wasn't going to make a mistake, that if I knew I was going to say something insightful, that if I knew I was going to say something perfect. For me, the false belief was I must be perfect to know I am of value. I must be perfect to know I am of value, which then led to the unhealthy behavior of perfectionism. I'm still that today. And that's what I saw in college. My inability to speak up in my discussion classes was because I was always wrestling with this idea that I had to say something perfectly, that my idea had to be mistake-free, that if I was going to contribute to something, it had to be something brilliant or genius. That was my false belief, which led to my unhealthy behavior. So that brings us back to the beginning. How do we change our behaviors? How do we change our behavior? We realize that in order to change our behavior, we have to change our belief. Or really, to change any of our unhealthy behaviors, we have to change our false beliefs. So whether it's perfectionism, whether you worry a lot, whether you are prone to really angry outbursts, whatever the unhealthy behavior is, in order to change that, we have to first change the false belief behind it. We need to identify and address this before we are able to change the behavior. We've got to change the false belief. The Bible actually has a lot of insight to that. The Bible calls that renewing your mind, renewing your mind. In Romans 12:2, the Apostle Paul has this great thing. He says, don't conform to the pattern of this world. Don't be ruled by that unhealthy behavior, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Address the belief that then affects the behavior. So when you hear a passage like this, you realize there's a lot going on in our minds. Because it's our minds that shape our beliefs. It's our mind that shape our beliefs, which then shape our behaviors and our emotions. So I think it's pretty safe to say there is a lot going on up here. At least for some of us, there's a lot going on up here. It's like a battle exists, and we need to constantly be renewing our mind. So for me, I still struggle with this even to today, and I imagine I'll probably struggle with it for most of my life, this unhealthy behavior towards perfectionism. Because somewhere along the line, it got ingrained in me, this false belief that I had to be perfect. This false belief that my value came from what I do versus the truth, which is my value comes from who I am. You know, a person loved by God, a child of God.
It's so easy for our behaviors to be shaped by our beliefs without even knowing that they are. When it comes to personal growth, we often focus on symptoms instead of causes. And it's no wonder, because of the advice we hear about personal growth focuses on changing problematic behaviors or negative emotions. But the driving force behind how we act and feel is what we believe. So if our beliefs drive our behaviors and emotions, how do we get rid of problematic behaviors and emotions? We change the beliefs that drive them. We all have beliefs that were influenced by 3 aspects of our past: relationships, Our parents, our peers, our spouse, our past spouses or significant others? Events. Now, not just negative events like trauma or rejection. It's also positive events like making every team we tried out for, experiencing success, etc. Church experiences or lack thereof. Yes, as it relates to our personal spiritual growth, some of us have been shaped by a rules-based version of religion. Or for some of us, we don't have a picture at all of how a church could impact our growth because it wasn't part of our past. And just like behaviors, emotions have beliefs behind them as well. Often, the world around us sends us messages that shape our emotions that, in turn, drive our behaviors. Messages like, if it feels good, just do it. Just go with your gut. Or, you only live once. The challenge with this philosophy is that our emotions can and will deceive us. Our emotions don't distinguish between fiction and reality, but there is hope. Chris shared the verse Romans 12:2, which instructs us not to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. To renew our minds, we have to replace the false beliefs that were formed in our childhood and drive our unhealthy behaviors and emotions with truth. Now, I know that may seem super spiritual or nice to do, but even if you aren't sure about following Jesus yet, you can do this, and it will make a big difference. We really believe that following Jesus will make you better at life and make your life better. Isn't it worth a try? I mean, what we've been doing thus far hasn't seemed to work, so why not give it a try? As the expert craftsman, God has given us a blueprint to follow that will bring freedom and peace to all of us. We can replace our false beliefs with the truth of what God says about us. Our first step for our personal renovation is to check our foundation to determine the areas of our life where we may need repair work, those areas where we have believed something about ourselves that is not true. So now we're gonna give you time to start your own renovation. And let me say up front that it will be tempting to skip over this section. Trust me, I know. I think I stopped and started this like 10 times. But I encourage you to stick with it. Your personal renovation will look different from someone else. And this next part is where you will determine where you are and what has influenced the way you think. We've provided a resource that will walk you through the process. You can do this. The renovation is worth it, and I'll see you back next time for session 2.